The morning sun had painted the sky in shades of amber and gold when Flight 227 departed from Manila, carrying 37 souls toward what should have been an ordinary journey to Singapore. Among them sat Rebecca Walsh, a wildlife photographer whose camera had captured the beauty of 6 continents. Yet nothing could prepare her for what lay ahead. Beside her, Tom Harrison nervously gripped his armrest. A software engineer on his first international trip, his excitement about the tech conference now replaced by an inexplicable dread that had settled in his chest since boarding. 3 rows back, Dante Rodriguez leaned against the window, his weathered hands clutching a worn leather journal. The former marine biologist had spent 40 years studying ocean predators, believing he had seen nature at its most terrifying. His daughter Sophie sat beside him, her medical textbooks spread across her tray table. Fresh out of residency, she had volunteered for a humanitarian mission, driven by the same fierce dedication that had defined her father's career. Across the aisle, James and Catherine Park whispered nervously to each other, newlyweds whose honeymoon plans were about to transform into a nightmare beyond imagination. The turbulence began without warning. The aircraft shuddered violently, throwing passengers against their seats as overhead compartments burst open, raining luggage and supplies into the aisles. Captain Morrison's voice crackled through the speakers, calm yet urgent, instructing everyone to brace for emergency landing. Rebecca's photographer instincts kicked in even through her terror, her hand steadying her camera as if documenting this moment might somehow protect her from it. Tom pressed his face against the window and saw something that made his blood freeze. The horizontal stabilizer was tearing away from the fuselage, metal screaming as it bent at impossible angles. The ocean rushed up to meet them with horrifying speed. The impact was catastrophic. Metal shrieked and twisted as the aircraft's belly struck the water, the force throwing passengers forward against their restraints. Water began flooding through ruptured seams immediately, cold and relentless. Rebecca found herself underwater, disoriented, her lungs burning as she fought toward what she hoped was the surface. Strong hands grabbed her collar and pulled upward. She broke through gasping, coughing seawater, and found herself staring into Tom's terrified face as he helped her toward an inflating emergency slide. The survivors hauled themselves onto the yellow raft, 15 people from the 37 who had boarded that morning. Sophie immediately began checking injuries with shaking hands, her training taking over despite her shock. Catherine clung to James, both of them too stunned to speak. Dante was already scanning the horizon, his experienced eyes searching for land. What he saw made him pause. In the distance, through the haze of smoke and salt spray, a dark mass rose from the ocean, too rugged and wild to be any charted island. They paddled desperately toward it, arms burning with exhaustion. The wreckage of Flight 227 was sinking behind them, taking with it supplies, communications equipment, and any hope of immediate rescue. As they reached the shore, Rebecca noticed something disturbing about the beach. The sand was littered with debris, but not all of it was recent. Scattered among the twisted metal from their plane were older remnants, wood and rusted equipment that spoke of previous disasters, previous survivors who had washed up on these shores. Tom discovered the shelter first, a crude lean-to constructed from aircraft aluminum and palm fronds, clearly built by someone who had been here before them. Inside, protected from the elements by layers of plastic sheeting, they found a waterproof box. Dante's hands trembled as he opened it, revealing a journal wrapped in oilcloth. The pages were yellowed and brittle, dated from 1943, written by Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hayes of the Army Air Corps. Rebecca leaned over his shoulder as he read aloud, his voice dropping to a whisper with each word. The entries were methodical at first, documenting coordinates and survival strategies. Hayes had crashed here with his crew during World War II, in an area he identified as the Dragon Triangle, a region of the Pacific notorious for unexplained disappearances. But as the dates progressed, the entries became more frantic, the handwriting deteriorating. Hayes wrote of something living on the island, something that had survived from an age when dinosaurs walked the earth. He called it Crocodilus giganteus, an estuarine crocodile that had grown to monstrous proportions in isolation, with no natural predators to check its growth. Sophie's hands went to her mouth as Dante continued reading. Hayes described the creature as being over 40 feet long, capable of dragging full-grown men into the jungle with terrifying speed. His crew had dwindled from 8 to 3 in a matter of days. The final entry was barely legible, written in what appeared to be blood. "It knows we are here. It is always watching. God forgive us for surviving this long only to die so terribly." James stood abruptly, his voice cracking as he spoke. "This is insane. Giant crocodiles? This is World War II propaganda or some survivor's delusion. We need to focus on real problems like finding fresh water and building a signal fire." Catherine nodded eagerly, desperate to believe her husband's rational explanation. But Dante's expression remained grave. He had studied crocodilians his entire career. In Australia, saltwater crocodiles regularly grew to 20 feet. In an isolated ecosystem with abundant prey and no human interference for 80 years, something larger was not just possible, but probable. Rebecca moved to the shelter's entrance and froze. In the soft sand beyond their camp, illuminated by the setting sun, were tracks. They were massive, each footprint nearly 3 feet across, the drag marks from a tail as thick as a tree trunk cutting between them. The tracks led from the jungle toward the beach, passing within 50 yards of where they now stood. She turned back to the group, her voice barely above a whisper. "We are not alone here." Night fell on the island like a predator's shadow, swift and absolute. The survivors huddled in the shelter, a small fire crackling between them, more for psychological comfort than warmth in the humid tropical air. Rebecca had volunteered for first watch, her photographer's eyes trained to notice movement in low light. Tom sat beside her, unable to sleep despite his exhaustion, his engineer's mind racing through impossible scenarios of rescue and survival. The others had finally succumbed to fitful sleep, their bodies demanding rest even as their minds remained trapped in nightmare. The sound came just after midnight, a low rumbling that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. Rebecca's hand shot out, gripping Tom's arm so tightly he gasped. The rumbling grew louder, accompanied by the crack of breaking branches and the rustle of massive displacement through undergrowth. Something enormous was moving through the jungle, circling their position. Tom's hand found a piece of metal wreckage they had sharpened into a makeshift weapon, though he knew instinctively that it would be useless against what Hayes's journal had described. The footsteps stopped. In the suffocating silence that followed, Rebecca became aware of another sound, a deep rhythmic breathing that seemed impossibly close. She slowly turned her head toward the jungle tree line and her heart nearly stopped. 2 eyes reflected the firelight, positioned at least 8 feet off the ground, unblinking and ancient. They watched the shelter with an intelligence that terrified her more than mere predatory hunger. This was not a mindless beast. This creature was assessing them, learning their patterns, planning its approach. Tom opened his mouth to shout a warning, but Rebecca clamped her hand over it, shaking her head frantically. If they woke the others now, panic would spread, and panic led to mistakes. They sat frozen for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, the eyes disappeared, and the sound of movement retreated deeper into the jungle. Only then did Rebecca release Tom, both of them gasping as if they had been holding their breath underwater. They did not sleep for the remainder of the night. Dawn brought little relief. Sophie insisted on checking her patients again, several survivors having sustained injuries in the crash. As she worked, James and Catherine ventured toward the beach, hoping to salvage more supplies from the wreckage that had washed ashore. Dante studied his compass, trying to establish their exact position, while Rebecca documented everything with her camera, some part of her brain still believing that evidence mattered, that civilization and rescue were possible concepts. Tom discovered the next piece of the puzzle near the shelter's rear. Partially hidden beneath fallen palm fronds was a crude map, carved into a piece of wood and sealed with tree resin. It showed the island's outline, surprisingly large, perhaps 5 miles across at its widest point. But what caught his attention were the markings scattered across its surface. Small X marks dotted the interior, each accompanied by initials and dates. He counted 37 marks spanning from 1943 to what appeared to be just 3 years ago. Beneath the map, carved in desperate letters, was a warning: stay on the beach. Never enter the jungle alone. It hunts at night. James and Catherine returned with promising news. They had found several sealed containers from the aircraft, including emergency rations, medical supplies, and most importantly, a working emergency beacon. Catherine's hand shook with excitement as she activated it, the device emitting a steady pulse that she prayed would reach any passing ships or aircraft. For the first time since the crash, Hope flickered among the survivors. Perhaps they would only need to hold out for a day or two. That hope died screaming 2 hours later. The group had gathered near the shoreline, organizing supplies and discussing rationing strategies, when Catherine suddenly stopped mid-sentence. Her face had gone white, her eyes fixed on something behind them. Rebecca turned slowly, following her gaze, and felt reality tilt sickeningly. Emerging from the tree line was a shape that defied belief, a creature that belonged in prehistoric times, not in the modern world. The crocodile was colossal beyond comprehension. Its head alone was the size of a small car, armored in thick scales that had darkened to nearly black with age. The body stretched endlessly, a ridge of armored scutes running down its spine like a dragon's crest. But it was the eyes that truly horrified Rebecca, ancient and calculating. The eyes of an apex predator that had perfected the art of killing over millions of years of evolution. It moved with surprising speed for its size, its massive legs propelling it across the sand with fluid grace. Someone screamed. The spell broke. Survivors scattered in every direction, primal fear overriding rational thought. James grabbed Catherine's hand and ran toward the rocky outcrops to the north. Tom and Rebecca sprinted for the shelter while Sophie tried to help an injured passenger who could barely walk. Dante stood frozen for a critical second, his scientific mind struggling to process what his eyes were seeing. Before his survival instinct finally kicked in, the creature's head swung toward the movement, focusing on the injured passenger, hobbling desperately across the sand. Sophie was pulling at the man's arm, screaming for him to move faster, but Rebecca could see they would not make it. The crocodile lunged forward with explosive speed, its jaws opening impossibly wide. The sound that followed would haunt Rebecca's nightmares for the rest of her life. The wet crunch of bone and the brief, terrible scream that was cut off with horrifying finality. Sophie stumbled backward, her face splattered with blood, her eyes wide with shock. The creature's jaws worked mechanically, swallowing its prey in massive gulps. Dante appeared from nowhere, grabbing his daughter and dragging her toward the shelter even as she fought against him. Her doctor's instinct screaming at her to help, to do something. Even though there was nothing left to save, they burst through the shelter's entrance and Tom immediately began piling wreckage in front of the opening, building a desperate barricade. Outside, the feeding continued. Rebecca forced herself to look away, to focus on the survivors crammed into the small space around her. She counted 9 people. They had lost 6 to the creature's attack. 6 people who moments ago had been talking about rescue and survival. Catherine was sobbing hysterically in James's arms. Sophie sat against the wall staring at nothing, her hands still trembling. Dante pulled out Hayes's journal again, flipping through the pages with new urgency, searching for anything that might help them survive. He found something. Near the back of the journal, Hayes had drawn a crude map similar to the one Tom had discovered, but this one included additional details. There was a cave system in the island's interior, marked with the words high ground, water source, defensible. Hayes's final surviving crew member had made it there, living for another 2 weeks before starvation took him. But the cave was deep in the jungle, and reaching it meant crossing the creature's territory. Tom looked at the barricade he had built and knew it would not hold if the creature decided to push through. The shelter was a death trap, offering the illusion of safety while actually boxing them in. He turned to face the group, seeing his own terror reflected in their faces. "We cannot stay here," he said quietly, his voice surprisingly steady. "We have 2 choices. Wait here for that thing to come back and finish us, or make for the cave system and hope we can defend ourselves there." Rebecca checked her camera, reviewing the footage she had captured of the creature. In one frame, she had caught a clear image of its eye, and what she saw there chilled her to the bone. Intelligence. The creature was not just hunting them. It was hurting them, driving them away from the beach where rescue might come, pushing them deeper into the island where it held every advantage. This was not going to be a simple matter of survival. They were not just fighting a predator. They were engaged in a battle of wits with something that had been perfecting the art of killing for longer than humans had existed. As if to confirm her thoughts, the rumbling began again outside the shelter, closer this time, accompanied by a new sound. A deep, vibrating hiss that made their bones ache. The creature knew exactly where they were. It was not trying to break in, not yet. It was doing something far more terrifying. It was waiting, patient as only a predator could be, because it knew something they were only beginning to understand. On this island, there was nowhere to run where it could not follow. nowhere to hide where it could not find them. The hunt had only just begun. The decision to move came with the first light of dawn, when the creature's rumbling had finally retreated into the depths of the jungle. Dante gathered everyone in a tight circle, his voice low and urgent. They would travel as a single group, no one straying more than arm's length from the others. Sophie distributed the medical supplies, tucking bandages and antibiotics into everyone's pockets. Rebecca checked her camera one more time, then reluctantly left it behind. Survival meant traveling light, and sentiment was a luxury they could no longer afford. Tom had fashioned crude spears from metal wreckage, their tips sharpened against rocks until they gleamed wickedly in the morning light. He knew they would be useless against the creature's armored hide, but the weight of a weapon in his hands provided a psychological comfort he desperately needed. James held Catherine close, whispering reassurances he did not believe himself, while she clutched the emergency beacon like a talisman, refusing to leave it behind despite its weight. The jungle was a wall of green that seemed to actively resist their entry. Vines thick as ship ropes hung from massive trees whose canopy blocked out the sky, creating a perpetual twilight beneath. The air was thick with moisture and the cloying scent of rotting vegetation. Every step required cutting through undergrowth, each swing of their makeshift machetes announcing their position to anything listening. Rebecca noticed the silence immediately. No birds sang. No insects buzzed. The jungle was holding its breath. They had been traveling for perhaps 2 hours when Dante held up his hand, signaling everyone to stop. He knelt beside a massive tree, his fingers tracing gouges in the bark that ran from ground level up to 15 feet high. "Claw marks him," he whispered, his voice tight with professional interest despite his fear. Fresh. It was here within the last few hours. Sophie moved closer, examining the marks with her medical precision. The depth of the cuts suggested incredible force, claws that could tear through flesh and bone as easily as paper. Tom consulted Hayes's map, trying to match the crude markings with their surroundings. According to his calculations, they were roughly halfway to the cave system, which meant another 3 hours of travel through increasingly dense jungle. But something was wrong. The path ahead seemed too clear, as if something large had recently pushed through, creating a corridor through the undergrowth. His engineering mind recognized it immediately as a classic funnel, a structure designed to channel prey toward a specific destination. He was about to warn the others when Catherine screamed. Everyone spun to find her pointing at something partially hidden beneath a fallen log. At first, Rebecca thought it was more wreckage from their plane, but as Dante carefully pushed aside the rotting wood, the truth became horrifyingly clear. It was a human skeleton, the bones picked clean and scattered, still wearing the tattered remains of a flight uniform. Around the neck hung a corroded metal chain with a single dog tag. Lieutenant Michael Hayes, 1944, the son. Rebecca felt her stomach turn. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes had mentioned his son in the journal, a pilot who had come searching for his father's lost expedition. He had found the island but never left. The skeleton's position told a story of desperate flight, one arm outstretched toward what must have once been safety, the other bent at an impossible angle where the creature had grabbed him. Sophie knelt beside the remains, her doctor's eye noting the distinctive tooth marks on the larger bones, evidence of how the creature fed. James grabbed Tom's arm suddenly, his voice barely audible. "We are being watched." Rebecca felt it too, that primitive instinct that humans had developed over millions of years of evolution, the sensation of predatory eyes tracking every movement. She scanned the jungle canopy and found what James had sensed. High above, camouflaged among the branches, something massive shifted position. Not the creature itself, but something equally terrifying. Evidence of intelligence and planning that elevated this from simple predation to calculated hunting. The creature had driven them here deliberately, to this killing ground where it had claimed so many previous victims. The clear path had not been an accident, but a carefully maintained trail, one that led directly to this natural amphitheater surrounded by dense jungle on all sides. They were trapped, herded like cattle into a slaughterhouse. Dante's face had gone pale as understanding dawned. He had studied predators his entire life, but nothing had prepared him for this level of strategic thinking from a reptile. Sophie's voice cut through the rising panic. "We need to move now, back the way we came." But Tom shook his head, pointing at the jungle behind them. Something large was moving through the undergrowth, blocking their retreat. The trap was closing. They could either stand and fight with their pathetic weapons, or they could run forward deeper into unknown territory, hoping against hope that Hayes's cave system offered genuine sanctuary. Dante made the decision for them. "Run!" The word was barely out of his mouth before the jungle exploded with movement. The creature burst from the tree line to their left, its massive body moving with terrifying speed despite its size. James pulled Catherine forward as the group scattered, running blindly through the undergrowth. Rebecca felt branches tearing at her skin, heard the thunder of the creature's footsteps behind them, felt the hot breath of the prehistoric nightmare that wanted them dead. Tom suddenly veered right, spotting something the others had missed. A narrow ravine cut through the jungle, too small for the creature to follow. He grabbed Rebecca's arm and pulled her toward it, shouting for the others. Dante heard and changed direction, dragging Sophie with him. James and Catherine were ahead, already scrambling down the rocky slope. The creature's roar of frustration shook the trees as its prey slipped through its massive jaws once again. They slid more than climbed down the ravine, rocks and loose earth cascading around them. Rebecca hit the bottom hard, the impact driving the air from her lungs. Strong hands pulled her to her feet. Tom. They were in a narrow canyon, the walls rising 30 feet on either side, creating a natural tunnel that ran deeper into the island's interior. According to Hayes's map, this was not marked. They were off the known territory now in uncharted land. The group moved forward in the semi-darkness, using their phones' dying batteries to light the way. The canyon walls were covered in scratches, evidence that the creature had tried to enter this space before but found it too confining. That gave Rebecca hope. Perhaps there were places on this island where the nightmare could not reach them. Perhaps they could survive after all. The canyon opened suddenly into a vast underground chamber, and Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. They had found Hayes's cave system, but it was so much more than she had imagined. The cavern was enormous, with multiple tunnels branching off in different directions. More importantly, light filtered down from cracks in the ceiling high above, creating pools of illumination that revealed the cave's most significant feature: water. The underground spring bubbled up from the cavern floor, creating a clear pool that meant they could survive here indefinitely. But they were not the first to discover this sanctuary. The cave walls were covered in markings, not just Hayes's methodical notes, but earlier inscriptions dating back decades, perhaps centuries. Spanish words mixed with Chinese characters, Japanese script alongside Portuguese. This island had been claiming victims for generations, each group of survivors eventually finding this cave, making their last stand here against the prehistoric horror that ruled the jungle above. Sophie found the most disturbing evidence in a side chamber. Bones. Hundreds of human bones, neatly stacked against the walls, each skull bearing the same distinctive marks where the creature had cracked them open. Dante examined them with professional detachment that barely masked his horror. The bones represented dozens of individuals, all different ages and time periods, all ending up in this cave, all eventually dying here. Whether from starvation, disease, or eventually venturing out and meeting the creature, none had escaped the island. Tom was already planning their defense, examining the cave's entrances, calculating how they could barricade the main opening. James helped him drag rocks and debris, building a wall that would slow but not stop a determined assault. Catherine activated the emergency beacon again, placing it near the light shaft where its signal had the best chance of reaching the outside world. Her hands shook as she worked, the reality of their situation finally breaking through her shock. Rebecca found herself drawn to the most recent inscription on the wall. It was dated 3 years ago, written in English with a steady hand. "My name is Dr. Elizabeth Chen. I have been on this island for 40 days. The creature has taken everyone else. I am the last. If you are reading this, then you have found what I could not: a way to escape. Please tell my daughter that I loved her. Please tell her that I never stopped fighting." Below the message was a skeleton, still wearing a researcher's vest with pockets full of notes about extinct species. Night fell outside, though in the cave's darkness time became meaningless. They huddled around a small fire, rationing the emergency food from the plane, knowing it would last perhaps a week if they were careful. Dante pulled out Hayes's journal again, reading the final entries more carefully this time. There, in the colonel's desperate scrawl, was a piece of information they had missed before. Hayes had discovered something about the creature, a behavior pattern that could be exploited. The creature was territorial, fiercely so, and it followed a routine. It hunted primarily at night and dawn, resting during the hottest part of midday in the deep jungle pools where it could regulate its body temperature. Hayes had observed this pattern and planned his escape attempt during those few hours of relative safety. He had gotten his remaining crew member to the cave, then gone back for supplies. He never returned, but the information might be enough to give them a chance. Tom laid out the plan. They would wait 3 days, conserving their strength and resources. On the 4th day, at exactly noon, they would make a run for the beach. Not all of them. Just 2 people moving fast and light, carrying the emergency beacon. If they could reach the shoreline during the creature's rest period, they could set up the beacon in an open location where it had the best chance of being detected. Meanwhile, the rest would remain in the cave, safe and hidden, waiting for rescue. The question was who would go. Rebecca volunteered immediately. She was fit, fast, and her photographer's training had taught her to move quietly when necessary. Tom stepped forward next, his engineer's mind already calculating routes and contingencies. Dante objected, arguing that his experience and knowledge should go, but Tom countered that they needed him to protect Sophie and the others if something went wrong. James started to volunteer, but Catherine's grip on his arm stopped him. She could not lose him too. The next 3 days passed in a strange suspension of time. They explored the cave system, finding evidence of previous survivors' desperate attempts at civilization. A crude altar suggested religious devotion in the face of death. A wall of names memorialized those who had not made it. Sophie organized the medical supplies they had carried, treating injuries and infections that were beginning to set in. James and Catherine found a measure of peace in each other's arms, love persisting even in the shadow of extinction. Rebecca spent hours studying Hayes's notes, memorizing the creature's territory and behavior. She learned that it was believed to be at least 80 years old, perhaps older, having survived for so long by being smarter and more adaptable than any reptile should be. It had learned to hunt humans specifically, developing tactics that suggested it understood human psychology and behavior. That intelligence was what made it truly terrifying. They were not fighting a mindless beast, but an apex predator that had evolved perfect killing strategies over millions of years. On the evening of the 3rd day, Sophie approached Rebecca privately. "When you get to the beach," she said quietly, "there is something you need to know. I found this in Dr. Chen's notes." She handed Rebecca a waterproof pouch containing research papers. Chen was a geneticist studying isolated species. She came here deliberately, following reports of the creature. Her research suggests something we have not considered. This thing is not just a survivor from the age of dinosaurs. It is actively evolving, adapting to hunt modern prey. Its intelligence is increasing generation by generation. If there are others like it, and if they are breeding, they represent an evolutionary branch that could theoretically challenge human dominance given enough time and isolation. The implications were staggering. If they escaped, they needed to make sure the world knew about this island, about the creature. Not just for rescue, but for the survival of future generations. This was not just about them anymore. It was about preventing others from stumbling into this prehistoric trap. Rebecca folded the papers carefully and tucked them into her waterproof bag. If she made it back to civilization, Dr. Chen's research would go with her. The 4th day dawned clear and hot, the midday sun beating down on the jungle with oppressive force. Tom and Rebecca prepared to leave, stripping down to lightweight clothing, carrying only water, the beacon, and one of Tom's metal spears. Dante embraced them both, his eyes conveying what words could not. Sophie pressed a first aid kit into Rebecca's hands. James and Catherine simply nodded, understanding that some goodbyes were too painful for words. They emerged from the cave into the bright jungle daylight, every sense on high alert. The heat was almost unbearable, the air shimmering with humidity. But the jungle was quiet, and according to Hayes's notes, that quiet was exactly what they needed. The creature would be resting now, conserving energy in the deep pools where the jungle's heart beat slowest. They had perhaps 3 hours to reach the beach, set up the beacon, and return to the cave before the monster resumed its hunting. They moved like ghosts through the undergrowth, making no sound, leaving no trail. Rebecca's heart hammered in her chest, but her breathing remained controlled, steady. Tom led the way, using the compass to maintain their bearing toward the shoreline. An hour passed, then 2. They could hear the ocean now, smell the salt air mixing with the jungle's rot. They were going to make it. Against all odds, they were going to reach the beach. That was when they saw it. Not the creature itself, but evidence of its intelligence that made Rebecca's blood run cold. Lying across their path, partially covered by leaves but clearly visible to anyone looking, was another skeleton, but this one was fresh. The bones still bearing traces of flesh and arranged in a pattern that was not natural. The skeleton had been deliberately placed here, positioned as a warning or perhaps as bait. The creature knew they would try to reach the beach. It had predicted their plan, and it was waiting. Tom grabbed Rebecca's arm and pulled her down behind a fallen log. They lay there in the stifling heat, barely breathing as the terrible truth settled over them. The 3 days in the cave had not been a respite. They had been part of the hunt. The creature had given them time to plan, time to hope, because it understood that hope made prey vulnerable. It had been waiting for them to try exactly this, to leave the cave during what they thought were safe hours, to expose themselves in their desperation. The hunter had become smarter than the hunted, and they had walked directly into its trap. The sound that followed confirmed their worst fears, a low rumbling that vibrated through the ground coming from directly ahead. Between them and the beach, blocking their escape, the prehistoric nightmare waited. Its intelligence had predicted their every move, and now it was time to finish what it had started when their plane first crashed onto this cursed island. Rebecca met Tom's eyes, saw her own terror reflected there, and in that moment, they both understood. They might not make it back to the cave. They might not survive the day. But they would fight with everything they had because that was what humans did. They survived,